Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today to our third cluster talk in the lecture series on decolonizing knowledge. And today Dr. Mahmood Kooria is going to present on the Malabar rebellion and the perspectives of the mules in that rebellion. Dr. Mahmood Kooria is an Indian Ocean historian whose work intersects with a wide variety of fields, among them Islamic law and transnational networks, matrilineal communities between Southeast Asia and North Africa, Indo-African communities, women travelers of the pre-colonial period, and more. He is a researcher at Leiden University, the Netherlands, where he completed his PhD in 2016. He also holds a research position at the University of Bergen in Norway and is a visiting faculty of history at Ashoka University in India. He was a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies and the African Studies Center in Leiden, the Dutch Institute in Morocco, Rabat, and the Social Science Research Council in New York. Dr. Kooria's most recent publication is the book Islamic Law in Circulation, Shafiri Texts Across the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, just recently actually. And for those of you in Glasgow, the book is already in our library. And I'm going to paste a link in the chat to a wonderful podcast I just heard with Dr. Kooria about his new book. And I do hope that we have an opportunity in the future also, Dr. Kooria, to engage with you on this topic here in Glasgow. Dr. Kooria also co-edited with the Indian Ocean historian Michael Pearson the pioneering book Malabar in the Indian Ocean, Cosmopolitanism in a Maritime Historical Region, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and co-edited with Zan Ravensbergen the book Islamic Law in the Indian Ocean, Texts, Ideas and Practices, published by Routledge 2022. He has also published in numerous peer-reviewed journals path-breaking research related to his wide-ranging expertise in Indian Ocean history. Today, he will present his work in progress on history as told from the perspective of animals, taking this cluster's interest in decolonizing knowledge to new levels. We have invited Dr. Kooria for a talk on a topic related to the Malabar Rebellion, as this year marks the centenary of the Malabar Rebellion against the colonial regime in pre-independence India. So, Dr. Kooria, the floor is yours, and we are all really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ophira Gamlail, for such a generous and detailed introduction. I have been traveling lately, and therefore my internet connection is like, depending on the places where I am. May not work well. I apologize in advance for this, but hopefully, it works as I move forward. And also, thanks very much to the research cluster that Dr. Gamlail and Dr. Saiko Izaki have been, putting together with a lot of very interesting talks on diverse aspects of, decolonizing knowledge. So today, my talk is roughly related to something that I have been working on lately as part of a project that started 10 years or even more than 10 years ago when I was doing my master's at JNU. Thanks to a generous grant that one of the audience members, Dr. Said Ashraf Tangal, has offered at that time. And interestingly, ever since I never made any, even though I have been working on this project ever since, I never made any talks or wrote any papers on this topic. That is on the rebellions that happened in Malabar in the 1920s. Not only in the 1920s, it sort of culminated in the 1920s, but something that happened that began much earlier. I'll come to the details in a while. So while working on this topic, I came across something very interesting, especially on the animals in the rebellions. And this is a field in itself, may not be for Malabar, but definitely in South Asian studies, South Asian history, world history, thanks to the very extensive scholarship that have come up in the last 2 decades, particularly, one of our colleagues and audience members, Anu Jalai, who is also with us today. So her work in the context of Bengal, the forest of tigers, right? Yeah. So it's one of the first works that I have, or the first work that I have read on the topic while I was doing my MPhil. And at that back in those days, I never thought that I will, end up working on a related thing. But as things will have it, as a matter of coincidences will have it, the presentation is sort of related to that. So I have share it with you. And this is also its interest. I think personally for me, it has its own interesting dimensions. I published an article in Malayalam on this theme, which I rarely do. I have mostly been trying to write my things in English, but recently I published an article on this, on this theme. It's semi-academic, semi-popular, or semi-public outreach sort of piece, but this is also possibly the first attempt that I make to put my observations and my materials in front of a erudite audience. So please feel free to put any of your suggestions on any of these themes. None of these are, concrete, hard thought conclusions. So I'll start 2 anecdotes on how I came about. I am more interested in Indian Ocean and the history of ideas, history of law. But then I came across, like I was reading as I was, doing research on Malabar rebellions. I was collecting several primary sources related to Malabar rebellion for the project that Said Ashraf Tangal at the at the Mapla Heritage Library in University of Calicut was, supporting. I came across, some debates that happened in the Imperial Council in the 1910s and 1910s. And there, this man, his name is Dinshaw Eduji Wacha, was a Parsi merchant from Mumbai, but he had connections. His family had, especially his father, had a lot of connections in Aden, and then they were trading there along with the British in the 19th century and 20th century. And while they were fighting over several aspects related to Malabar rebellion that was, at the peak in the 1910s and 20s, he refers to the import of particular animals, particularly mules, from Mauritius to Aden and to India, a business that particularly his father had, took contract for the British during the first mutiny in Indian history. It's often identified in various names: the first independent struggle of 1857, or as the first mutiny, first Scipio mutiny, and so forth. So he says that in the Imperial Council debates that for the mutiny, or in order to support the British Army, his father and some colleagues had helped the British import mules from Mauritius to India via Aden, where his father and his colleagues were based. For me, this was a very interesting moment, so to speak, particularly just before this document, which I wouldn't have paid attention if I hadn't seen another document, which was particularly, a document related to the Malabar Rebellion from around 1910, in which the British officials or the army members are debating and exchanging correspondences on replacing or on the need for replacing elephants in the Malabar region with mules, because they thought that the elephants are very expensive and mules are comparatively economical, and therefore, and then they have a lot of correspondence on diverse aspects. I'll come to this particular document in the course of the time, but then this document, when I put it along with the previous one, I found it very interesting, because Malabar rebellions and Indian Ocean are hardly thought together. And for me, this was an interesting element, because in Malabar, the mules or the asses or the donkeys, all varieties of those, there are even the ponies or even horses, are not comparatively well known or well fed or well grown in the region. They are comparatively more or less always imported from outside. And suddenly we have this, sort of a broader subcontinental or transcontinental dimension that contributed to the understanding of, some of the minute or even interesting dimensions on the rebellions. And what is when I mentioned Malabar, so the rebellions for the people in India or South India, or particularly Kerala, this is something very familiar. But I would like to briefly mention, for those who are not, familiar with the sequence of events that happened in the 19th and 20th century South India. Immediately after the British East India Company or English East India Company took over the Malabar region from the Mysore Sultan, the Tipu Sultan, in 1792, there were a series of battles against the British, and the series of mobilizations, political, agrarian, of various sorts, mobilizations against the British. And these battles or these struggles or rebellions continue to remain in the region, even though the British officials, the British missionary, tried to suppress it in various ways. It never did cease to exist. And we see them we see constant struggles between the local population and the colonial officers and their intermediaries. Some of the intermediaries being, from the region itself. And the struggles are of various nature or various motivation. They sometimes are related to agricultural concerns, sometimes they are related to land concerns, sometimes related to revenue and taxation and things like that. And often they started with a legal, or litigation when the colonial courts were established. But also before that, there were series of complaints with the local qadis and local arbitrators. But eventually, when all those sort of failed or were not necessarily materialized, they many of the local communities took up arms and mobilized, came together and then fought against not only the British Empire and its officers, colonial officers, but also the all the people who were standing in between, who were mediating between the empire and then the local communities. In the time frame, we have to keep in mind that even though 1921 lately has been celebrated as a centenary of the Malabar rebellions, we have to keep in mind that 1921 or 1922 is not the year of Malabar rebellion. We have to see them as part of a series of rebellions that have happened between almost a century and a half in the region. Immediately after the British takeover until it was brutally suppressed in the 1922. And some of the, I'm not going to the statics, but like, the murder and the castrations and, imprisonments, exiles, deportations, all these are very brutal in the 1920s, but not only in the 1920s, even before that also in 1850s, 60s, many people from the region, Malabar region, were deported as far as to St. Helena and, Australia, as well as like, Andamans and so forth. The foundational motivations, this is something that several historians have dealt with. Not only historians, even the colonial officers themselves were, during their investigations, they came up with different theories. And in the post-colonial context, some of the historians have bought into the same argument that their predecessors in the colonial period have, brought up, but also there were new theories. So people have identified, whether in colonial period or post-colonial period, historians or scholars have identified the rebellions being agrarian or anti-colonial, anti-caste, communal, Islamic and fanatical, and all sort of different adjectives have been used. I'm not going to the details, like, to see which one, like, what was the true nature of the rebellions, because it's not my immediate concern. Instead, I mean, these are some of the interesting works if you are interested in looking at, particularly written by local scholars. Ken Panikkar, his work Against Lord and State, published by Oxford University Press in 1988, still, I would say, still one of the most important works in the on the Malabar rebellions. And the last work, M.T. Ansari, has written several articles, and his latest book, I think, came out in 2015, has at least two very interesting articles on Malabar rebellions, along with, several other dimensions on, depictions of Malabar in the colonial records and so forth. So from there, my, so that is a general overview of the Malabar rebellions. And from there, my immediate concern is not about agrarian, the true nature of the rebellions, something that most historians have dealt with, but like it's about the animals, like, something, an area that I would say no one has studied in the context of rebellion, but not only in the context of Malabar rebellions, but also in the history of Malabar or Kerala at large. So therefore, this is something that, out of my just curiosity from these two documents that I sort of related myself with my existing research interest, I thought it's very interesting to explore, these rebellions, this series of rebellions from their perspective. And there, of course, there is a vast amount of literature on the, particularly the large, in the South Asian historiography, we have very important works, such as, like, for example, the marvelous study of Simon Digby that came out in 1971. I read it very recently, and still, even though it is written almost 50 years ago, and it's just 100, around 110 pages, still, like, very insightful in various ways. It's on the medieval period, basically looking at the animal supply or the military supply during the Delhi Sultanate. And there are, of course, Anu Jale's work that I just mentioned, which is also the first work that I have read, with this perspective on human, non-human interaction in population context. And recently, two other works that I like the most is, like, Radhika Singh. It's not only on the animals, but, like, for mules and muleteers, she has, like, extensive discussions on this topic. And then in the Indian Ocean context, at least, this edited volume that I have put in the next slide would be very useful for those who are interested to explore. And something that I am not, like, again, it's not an exhaustive survey of the literature or historiography on South Asian history of animals or Indian Ocean history of animals, but some of the works with which I am familiar. But also there are, global history of animals, which also, from my limited reading, I have taken some inspiration into in analyzing some of my materials. So I would put these two works, from two ends of historiography. One, Simon Digby's 1971, basically it's a lecture that he had given in 1960s, eventually published as a small monograph, Warhouse and Elephant in the Delhi Sultanate. And this book, Animal Trade Histories in the Indian Ocean, it's came out, I think, in 2020 or 2021. Also has a lot of interesting essays on diverse aspects of, business of animals in the Indian Ocean trade. And once we come from there, to the rebellions and animals, why should we look at animals in the rebellions? There's an interesting work by Jason Rebel, who particularly look at the animal resistance in the early modern, late medieval, early modern period in Europe, where he basically says that one of the things that in the early modern period Europeans were mostly concerned was the resistance that the animals posed to the humans. They didn't want to obey the rules that the humans have put out for them. So they introduced, humans introduced various sorts of oppressive measures, such as chains or or particular cages and so forth, in order to resist the resistance from the animals. And he says that this was one of the most feared things for humans in their everyday life. So this work is, even though it's about the resistance from an animal perspective, still it gives some insights when we when I try to understand what was their role in the rebellions that humans were fighting with other humans. Yeah. And Jeffrey Sinclair has an interesting introduction to this book. And when we take animals in the rebellions, they give us different perspectives. Of course, instead of looking at the natural battles or fights between different humans, once we bring animals into perspective, it encourages us to think of the ultimate nature of the violence, and what is the basically the nature of of course humans are animals, but beyond that essentialist reading, what makes humans different from animals when they are killing their own their own caste, so to speak, or their own people. And if the rebellions or battles or wars are anomalous moments in the long history of humans, still that particular anomalies encourages us to think about the larger patterns in which how humans treat one another, as well as how humans treat other animals, whether they are dogs or cattle or mules and so forth. So the battlefields or rebellious fields are therefore very interesting moments, of course philosophically, but also as students for researchers into the human minds and human nature. And there are the questions of agency of silence and agency. Can the animals speak for themselves or for their masters or their their colleagues and things like that. And this is also something that we can ponder about, even though the materials themselves are not necessarily forthcoming, but still from the fragmentary materials that we have, we can read several things, or at least raise questions on the agency of the the animals. And also something that I am particularly interested is the competitions between local and extra local animals. So there are animals such as cows or oxes or goats or all sort of different animals that were indigenous to Kerala or Malabar, And there are animals like mules or horses that were often brought from outside. And in a battlefield, often this is a fight between a local animal and a non-local animal, like that's a colonizer and a colonized, right? The colonized animal versus the colonizing animal, just like the British and the Indians. But still, like I would explain this further, particularly when it comes to the mules. They were fighting against not only humans but also their immediate counterparts, which were the bullocks and bullock carts. So in my research, what I have been like, when I started looking into the materials
until he's back. Okay. So I think we stopped at just the beginning of this slide, 5 animals.
Yeah. So thanks once again. So sorry. So on the 5 animals, these are, animals in my focus areas, but I'm not going into the details of all the, specific dimensions of these animals. But of course, we can come back to them later if anyone is interested, because all these animals had, were at the forefront of the Malabar rebellions. That's why I picked them. But also there can be, other animals that were at least in the margins, or not necessarily so important. And there is I would also add rats or mice, because particularly there's a long poem written by one Mappila leader, Mahmood Kooria, one of the most important. He has a very interesting poem. So I was thinking of adding an additional category on the mice or rats, and the it's a sort of allegorical to what was happening in the region, because it talks about a battle between the rats and, of course, rats and cats, right? So, but then it's a very lengthy poem. But for now, I think I'll focus on mules. Why mules? So mules, of course, they are well known for their, adaptability and their uses in the war front. They are particularly known for being, adaptable to both heat and rain and all sort of different weather regimes. They also are known for their capacity to carry a load as much as the horses would carry. And also, even if they are wounded or if they are, attacked, still they would, with their, commitment to the objective or the aim, they would persist in their, in the task that they were given. So all these things made mules very popular in the war front, in the battlefields. And there's this very interesting quote that I came across from Charles Darwin, where he says that mule always appears to me a most surprising animal. But also there's another interesting, Malabari quote from 16th century, famous anti-Portuguese text of Fatul Mujahideen, where the author says, when he inspires people to fight against the Portuguese, that a warrior should be like a mule with the same persistence, and especially carrying its loads when even when wounded. And possibly even though this particular allegory or metaphor of a warrior with a mule was written for the Malabari audience during the course of the anti-Portuguese or the Portuguese, Indo-Portuguese wars, possibly they must have had its currency in Malabar during the anti-British resistance or anti-British movements in the region. And mules were used in the rebellion in various various functions. One of the most important or the earliest reference that I came, for their use in the rebellions is from 1894, during a particular rebellion in a small region called Pandikar. when when the Malappuram Special Police, and now it is known as Malabar Special Police, still functioning in the region, but a colonial institution that was established much earlier. So from this particular region called Pandikat, the police station informed their headquarters at Malappuram that they need immediately a police force to suppress a rebellion that has come up. So when people got ready, the police, the privates and the commanders and so forth, they got ready to go there. There were 6 mules also accompanying them, along with 6 elephants, from Malappuram to Pandikat. And they were mainly carrying ammunition. According to the sources, they were carrying ammunition, and 8 case shot, 8 common shell, and and then the guns and so forth. Whereas the elephants were carrying larger materials such as cooking utensils, hospital requisites, blankets, and so forth. And we see that, interestingly, this is because this is the earliest reference. I take this as a starting point for for the presence of mules, or the use of mules in the colonial army in the region. And it might be interesting to see, even though the mules were imported to the region, to the subcontinent from the places like Mauritius, at least 3-4 decades, these mules must have been dispersed to different parts of the subcontinent after the British, or after the mutiny, the Sepoy mutiny, or the 1857 rebellion was suppressed. So these, mules must have been sort of related to the use of, the colonial use of mules in the imperial army. And down the road, 10 years later, or 15 years later, from 1910, we have this interesting correspondence that I mentioned. One of the first documents that I came across, a military correspondence on the on the mules particularly. So in this one, and in the following pages that you can see here, the first page, the different military officers are demanding or requesting their higher authorities to replace the elephants that were already functioning or were already operating in the region. They thought that the elephants are very expensive, but also very slow, especially if they want to move at the war front, following the rebels, following the outlaws. The elephants often move very slow, therefore they can't, catch up to the rebels. And then they requested their higher authorities that at least, for the price of 3 elephants, we can buy up to 12 mules. And then they give, detailed accounts or detailed, budgetary or finance financial details of how this can be beneficial in the long run. And also another argument that they make is that in the local in the region, Mapilas or the Mapila Muslim community were one of the major communities at the forefront of the Malabar rebellions. They are also the main drivers of the bullock carts that were being used widely in the region. So in the hinterlands, bullock carts were the most common or widely used medium of transportation, and the drivers of almost all of these carts were Mapilas, who were at the forefront of the the rebellions. And therefore the British army officers thought that when there is a rebellion, you can't rely on the bullock carts or their drivers because they are Mapilas. Even though many Mapilas were against the rebellions, and then we have a lot of interesting details on how the Mapilas themselves issued fatwas or issued pamphlets against the rebellions. but still, like, there was a sort of like a blanket generalization from the side of the British against the Mapula bullock cart drivers. Yeah. So basically, like, it's sort of like, this letter demonstrates, or the series of exchanges demonstrates the colonial scrutiny of expenditures and profits, but also the biases against the community despite their repeated negation or reluctance to fight or to participate in the rebellions. And once we come later, in the later we see them, particularly the mules being used across Malappuram, particularly the Malappuram being the southern Malabar region, from where the most of the rebellions were happening. And we see that, like, particularly the British regime asking to employ the mules to carry the provisions that were being brought, provisions and also ammunitions that were being brought from Mumbai or Bangalore or other places to the coastal, coastal region to be exported to the hinterland. So they were, brought to the Malappuram and also to further hinterland military outposts by the mules. And also there was, like, when all these things were important, there were also a lot of, battalions, particular muleteers, specializing with, maintaining and driving and, carrying the goods on the mules across the region. So from the 1890s, like, part of the Malappuram Special Police, they were functioning, and then they were expanded by the 1910s. But by the 1920s, they were, imported from other regions, like, from other regions of the subcontinent, but also outside. Yeah. And this is, like, this point, discrimination against muleteers is basically an argument that comes from Radhika Singha, where she explains in detail how muleteers were, racially and also occupationally discriminated within the imperial, army. And therefore, because of this discrimination, there was a lot of hesitation among Indian soldiers to participate in the or to be part of the mule corps. Despite of that, we see them being employed in the region, not only in the region, but they were also, of course, part of the larger, First World War and Second World War. Like, many of them participated quite extensively. Yeah. And my final point is on, from the perspective of the Mapilas or the rebels, they often attacked mules particularly. And that is an interesting point. We have two interesting episodes. Like, there are several episodes on how rebels attacked the mules, but and they are interesting. Like, at least I would take two episodes, and because they demonstrate interesting features on why particularly the rebels attacked the mules. So the first episode comes from this place called Arikot, where the mule corps was attacked when they were fetching water from the river. And the documentation, this particular document on the right side shows that, this particular attack was documented in the larger, like, one of the most important events in the history of the Malabar rebellions, that is the capture of the leader, Varian Kunat Punyahamadaji. So immediately before his capture, when they report these things, they also report the attacks on the mules, and which definitely demonstrate the importance that this small incident possibly must have had in the larger, information and colonial logic that the British at that time had. And the second incident is, from this Kondoti, a place called Kondoti, where, you know, a group of Mappilas who were on their way to the most important, you know, Sufi shrine in the region called Mamburam Makam. You know, on their way, you know, when the British encountered them, they attacked not the British officers, but their mules. And it's interesting why the Mappilas should attack, especially those who are going for the pilgrimage to the shrine. They should attack, you know, these animals. And it's mainly because, you know, they thought from the British side that they thought the pilgrimage to the shrine was a prelude or a preface to a rebellion that they, you know, that these pilgrims would undertake. But from the perspective of the Mappilas, the attack on the animals was, you know, was strategies to disarm the imperial army, because, you know, all the ammunitions and all the guns and weapons of the army were being carried by the mules, right? So if you attack the mules, then, you know, the army is basically, you know, is powerless. They can't, you know, carry all the ammunitions by themselves to all different posts that the rebels were going. So basically, once the mules are dismembered or, you know, attacked or killed, then the whole army becomes basically like a motionless or like a helpless, you know, bunch of, you know, humans. So that is why possibly the Mappilas were targeting the mules instead of targeting the humans themselves. So some tentative conclusions in the interest of time, quickly. So rebellious animals demonstrate, you know, the changes in human perspectives of themselves as well as, you know, other animals in the region. And you know, once we focus on the mules, their diverse functions in the region, one thing that stand out is their competition with the local bullock. Primarily, the very reason why they were imported to the region, that was mainly to compete or to replace the most important medium of transportation in the region, headed by the Mappila community. And the mules, when they did arrive in the region, they were carrying the empire and its, you know, all sort of different machineries to the hinterlands, from ammunitions to provisions to the soldiers. And attacks on mules can also be read as an attack on the empire. Basically, like, you know, when the mules cannot move, the empire itself, you know, becomes motionless, I would say. And, you know, in the letters that, you know, some of these documents that we can see, you know, the colonial concerns of economics, like, you know, finances and politics, when they demand replacement of elephants with mules. And then, you know, thanks to the last point is to pose to Radhika Singha for her emphasis on, you know, the racialized labor hierarchy or hierarchical structure within the army. And these are some of the tentative, you know, starting points, I would say, instead of conclusions, for a larger emphasis on the role of mules or animals at large in the Malabar rebellions. I think with this, I'll conclude. Yeah, I took a bit beyond my time, but thank you for your attention.
That's okay. We lost you for a few good minutes. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and new ideas about how to read history. And, you know, I open the floor for questions. If anybody would like to raise their hands. I have lots of questions. I mean, I can start while you think about your own questions, but do feel free to open your videos and your microphones so we can engage in discussion. Okay, I'll start with a question. You talked in the beginning about agency and the voice of animals. And I was wondering whether you can say a little bit more about that. How when we look at animals and their perspectives in history, how can we really, as humans, with the language, how we can learn something about their perspectives?
it's, you know, from my immediate materials, it's difficult to say. At least, like, you know, once we, because, you know, almost all these materials are produced by humans for humans, right? But still, like, you know, some of their silences or their resistance, as you know, this Jason Hibber's work in that sense is very important. You know, some of the minute points in which, for example, there's a interesting mule, like an episode, an anecdote told about a mule that was, you know, refusing to board a ship when it was being exported as part of the First World War. And, you know, almost all the people on the on the deck have had to, you know, force this mule to get into the ship. You know, that was big. So it didn't want to leave the port, so to speak. So that particular point, once we analyze, like, you know, of course, you know, the all the descriptions or the archival materials from 1914, and this particular episode comes from 1914. It sort of encourages us to think why that particular animal was, you know, hesitating to board on a ship. So I think it encourages us to, like, you know, instead of thinking only from our own perspective and our own concerns, we can, you know, possibly take different uh, uh, potential thought processes that they must have been going through. Yeah.
Dania, please.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. So interesting, and especially that perspective of, you know, starting from a mule to kind of build up and kind of link it to the resistances at the time. So I had two questions. One is, if you could tell us something, because it's the Indian Ocean and all kind of the littoral. So if you could talk, and you mentioned Wacha is a Parsi trader who from Yemen, the route. So if you could just tell us something about, you know, what was sustaining, so what are the communities that were sustaining the trade in mules at the time? So just to flesh out that, you know, there was a wider context to this discussion. Also, the second question was in relation to the law, and I wanted to understand what was the reaction of the British to the two episodes you mentioned when mules were being targeted. So for instance, what are the records on legal ownership, compensation, litigation around, you know, so was there any reaction through legislation about, you know, prohibiting or preventing, you know, killing mules or kind of disarming? And so, yeah, just to flesh out some of that context. Yeah, these are two questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for very important questions. I must say that I don't have a lot of information on either front. So on the communities, I think the Parsi community, so he particularly mentions his father's role in importing the goods from Mauritius to India via air then. And particularly they took this, you know, in as a contract, you know, on contract from the British, who themselves were interested in importing the animals from the region. So I think, like, you know, I don't know, you know, this particular in Vachas or these Parsi communities case particularly, they didn't continue, you know, this business possible, and we can't, you know, see that, you know, particularly at least in this case of, you know, his son, when he makes this statement, they have moved into other businesses, and it was not their main business either, you know, even when they were importing the animals, the mules from Mauritius. So I think it was part, like, you know, at that period, it was more sort of a temporary import and export of animals. But I think once we come to the early 20th century, there were particular intermediaries that were working for the British Empire, particularly finding mules, and also mules in that sense is, like, you know, very interesting, because no one really wanted to associate themselves with the mules, right? With the horses, with the elephants, you know, there are a lot of communities who often took it as a, like, you know, caste occupation, For example, the elephants and the what do you call it, the mahots. So there's particular caste groups such as the Paniyas in Kerala who identified themselves as mahots, in the region. Whereas mules and muleteers, we see them like, often, even though they come from the same caste background as other sepoys or, other soldiers in the British Army, Indian soldiers in the British Army, the mule related occupations were often temporary, that when they had a chance they would move to other occupation, or they would discontinue. Like, even if they didn't have a chance, they just didn't want to be part of the muleteer, mule corps. And the viceroy of India at that time, he particularly complains of the reluctance from the side of Indians on joining the mules. And when there are, Radhika Singha gives exact numbers, when they wanted about 1 million or something mules, they were getting only half of what they needed. So I think with mule related trade and occupation and military and so forth, it was mostly, I would say, seasonal or temporary than any other animals or other communities that specialize in dealing with particular animals. And on the law and legal sides of these things, these are very, of course, I'm very interested in this particular question, how, as I myself is interested in the history of law and litigation during and before the British or the European intervention. But in both instances, what we have is only very patchy references, right? Paragraph or maximum 2 paragraphs. And sometimes, in the first document that I showed, we have maybe 3 pages of correspondences on mules. Otherwise, these are very small paragraphs. And mules, again, are downtrodden animals in the colonial documentations as well. They are not really taken into consideration until much later. I think only in the post-colonial period, in the 1960s, when there was I think in the 1967, right, there was this particular law enacted by the Parliament on the protections of mules and the kind of burden or the loads that they were allowed to take on their back. So that kind of litigation happened much later. But so far, I haven't seen any litigation or any detailed legal discussions on the rights of mules or rights and duties of the owners and so forth. Yeah. But I think it will be interesting to explore all these things, particularly because there was a very prominent mule corps that was functioning in Surat, in Meerut, in different parts of northwestern provinces, and also in different parts of South India. So far, I haven't come across any detailed studies on any of these dimensions. Yeah. But thank you for raising such interesting questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dania is an expert on contract law, and she specializes. And now you're studying indigo contract laws, right? In which region? In the Mughal Empire, right?
This is colonial. The Indigo Rebellion.
The Indigo Rebellion. Yes.
Fascinating.
So also related to rebellions. Yeah. Some more questions?
I would
Yes.
like to ask a very general question on, what about the animals from the side of the rebels? Is there any kind of mentioning that? Have you ever come across some of the animals which were used by the rebels for a long time, like horses, which they can use during the time of rebellion? And is there something very Islamic, something like that? Is there any kind of debates, the legalities debates from the Islamic law, some kind of fatwas related to the using of animals, something like that? Or we can also come across some of the literatures, as you already told about Moinkutti Vaidyar's poem on cats and the the battle between the cats and the rats, as
Yes.
well as we can also come across some of the other animal mentioning, because actually in my PhD I wrote a bit about it as well. So I was just wondering in the later half of in the early half of the 20th century, that is there some kind of mentioning about that, like rather than the Mappila literature as such in that case.
Okay, so again, very interesting questions. I would say that, so the other out of the 5 animals that I look at, that I focus, particularly elephants were used by the Mappila rebels, specifically in the hinterlands, in the Malabar, in the eastern Malabar region. So that is Nilambur, Kaligav, all these regions, the Western Ghat, region. And we have interesting, so I have, in this, as a follow-up to the mules, what I have written is on the elephants. And we see them, various ways in which they used elephants, particularly to escape from the British attacks, the army attacks, and also to carry particular materials, war materials or rebel, their ammunitions and weapons. They're using the elephants. Horses, they do use it, but very rarely. So there is a very interesting class dimension there. So in Kerala or in Malabar, the ordinary Mappila fighters or Mappila people or ordinary people mostly use bullock carts, right? And that was something that was very common. If you are not walking, if you are not a pedestrian, then you depend on the bullock cart. Whereas the upper class Mappilas, someone like in the Sayyids or the Hadramis, they would use the horses. And in the rebellion, there is one Hadrami Sayyid who is captured along with his horse and the jedka or the horse cart. What is it called? The wagon, right? Mm-hmm. And he's captured and is interrogated how he got the, how and why he got the horse and things like that. So we can see that, some other Hadrami Sayyids also using horses, while the ordinary Mappila people were mostly using bullock carts. And so that's also even in the use of the animals, there's a class difference that is very evident in the ways in which the animals were used. On the Islamic prescriptions or prescriptions.
Because I'm just asking just to make one more point with that, because you in the final animal is dog, right? So and the Britishers always compare Mappilas with the dog sometimes. So when the colonial police always use dogs for searching, so about dogs, is there any some kind of that touching the dogs or something, like it's very, very new, like in that sense, like. So what about is there some kind of thing that if your dog touches something, some kind of fatwas or legal writing, something like that related to that, or it just mentioning?
Not necessarily during the rebellious period or during the rebellions, but definitely there are legal explanations given. For example, from the text like Fatul Mu'in, written by the same scholar that I mentioned, Sheikh Zainuddin. Who describes, and particularly the Shafi school of law, has a very specific dimensions or specific prescriptions compared to the Hanafi school, which is more liberal in their approach towards the dogs, whereas the Shafis are very sort of conservative in their approach towards the dogs. So Sheikh Zainuddin in the 16th century, he writes about this sort of differences in terms of approaches towards dogs. But for me, what is interesting is once the moment when I thought I want to write about dogs as part of the Mappila rebellion is that the statistics, there is a statistic record from I think September 1921, where the same number of dogs butchered or killed in Malabar are almost as the same as the number of Mappila Muslims who are butchered or killed in the region. Of course, like completely for different reasons. Dogs are rebels in the streets, and the British and the local people wanted the street dogs to be killed, but almost with the same logic. I wouldn't say the same with the same logic, but almost with the same logic. They also wanted to get rid of the mapilas. So, and it's about like 9,000 mapilas and 9,000 plus dogs were killed in the region. And I thought it's very interesting to see, to put these things together, to see the nuances in the ways in which the British Empire dealt with the animals of various background, human background or the bestial background. But also there are interesting moments where the British officers, for example, the British commander, the police commander at that time, Hitchcock, R.H. Hitchcock, I think he's called. He is bitten by a dog at the peak of the rebellion, and even though he is taking it, as a casual, or the empire is taking it as a casual incident, we have a lot of context or situation to assume that it was an intentional move, or like it was like an orchestrated move from some of his employees who were sympathetic to the rebellion. So I think there are that kind of parallels also, where dogs also appear as active agents in the rebellion. Yeah.
Thanks, Kooria, and it was a wonderful talk for getting a new perspective on rebellion. Actually, especially at the 100th year celebrations of 1921. Yeah.
Celebrations. Yeah, thank you so much. Saiko, would you like to say a few words or ask a question just to wrap up? I saw you had some thoughts.
Oh yes, but actually, Mahmood already touched upon those issues. I just wanted to say that the title of this talk was looking at the rebellion differently, and I was just wondering, if focusing on different animals would tell different stories or not. This time it's mules or not, but you touched upon that, and it's already 10 parts, so maybe we need to wrap up. But yeah, it was a very interesting way of looking at historical events. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And Mahmood, I really look forward to see the article in English, even though I feel a little bit embarrassed to say that I should try and read it in Malayalam. I'm sure it is a very fluent and clear Malayalam to read. So I'll try. And I hope to hear from you again with us in this context on your new book. I just put again in the chat the link to the podcast for those of you who missed that, and I hope that you listen to it. And that's it. I think we are done with our decolonization lecture series for this year, but you will hear again from us, and I think we're going.
Fear my connection is somehow.
It's again. Okay, so let us finish now, and good night to those of you in India, and have a lovely evening for those of you here.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mahmood.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for